Well, Richard Fontaine is the president of the Center for a New American Security, also known as CNAS, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He previously served as a senior advisor and senior fellow at CNAS from 2009 to 2012. He was a foreign policy advisor to the McCain 2008 presidential campaign, and following the election, the minority deputy staff director on the Senate Armed Services Committee. Prior to this, he served as Associate Director for Near Eastern Affairs and in Asian Affairs Directorate at the National Security Council. He also served as the chairman of the World Economic Forum's Global Agenda Council on the U.S. and worked at the State Department in the office of the former Deputy Secretary of State, Richard Armitage. He's been an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service and spent a year teaching English in Japan. A native of New Orleans, Mr. Fontaine graduated summa cum laude with a BA in International Relations from Tulane University and received an MA in International Affairs from the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, also known as SAIS. He lives in Falls Church, Virginia with his wife and 4 children. I should mention that we're very appreciative to Dr. Fred Axelgard, who's a senior fellow at the Wheatley Institution, for helping to make today's lecture possible. We appreciate his friendship and partnership. Please join me in welcoming Richard Fontaine.
Well, thank you very much for having me today, and special thanks to Fred Axelgard, as you mentioned, for inviting me to address you and to spend some time here at BYU. It's wonderful to be here at the Kennedy Center and have had great meetings just over the past day or so, and I'm delighted to speak to you for a little bit about India and its future role and its relations with the United States. And to set the stage for this, I'd ask you to think back just a couple of months when India conducted the largest election in the history of humanity. More than 540 million Indians streamed to the polls over 6 weeks. And in so doing, they transformed the politics of their country and set the stage for potentially a new era of relations with the United States. In those elections, for the first time in 30 years, one party, the BJP, which was and remains headed by the former Chief Minister of the state of Gujarat, Narendra Modi, took an outright majority in the Indian Parliament. The BJP won 282 out of the 548 seats in the Lok Sabha, which is the lower house of Parliament and the one where most of the legislation and activity takes place. What this means is that unlike every other government for the past 30 years, the ruling party is not reliant on coalition partners to pass legislation. And the BJP won a sweeping mandate that revolves centrally around economic reform. In dominating the elections, Modi's party really decimated the previous Congress Party government. The Congress Party had a truly historic set of losses in the elections and dropped down to 44 seats in the lower chamber. This was a stunning blow to the party of Jawaharlal Nehru, of Indira and Rajiv Gandhi, the party that has dominated Indian politics for most years since independence in 1947. A lot of observers, not just in India and around the world, sort of pointed to the elections as a historic moment, one of these opportunities that bring truly dramatic change in India's political and economic fortunes, and ultimately its foreign policy ambitions and its ties with the United States. And these developments followed several years of rather searching questions about precisely what India's ambitions are in the world, about what kind of regional and global power India wishes to be, and in fact, really what kind of global power India can be, what it has the capacity to be, what it has the power and the economic development to be. When we're talking about India, it's worth recalling some of the fundamental facts about the country. 1/6 of humanity is Indian, which is a fact that we sometimes forget. 1 in a quarter billion people. A few years ago, I was passing through the airport in Calcutta, and I met very briefly the American Consul General, who is based in Calcutta and is responsible for the consular district in that part of the country. And she remarked to me that the number of Indians living in her consular district exceeds the numbers of Americans in the United States. She has over 350 million people living in her consular district. And that kind of hit home to me, just the size of the country that we're talking about today. It's, of course, the world's largest democracy. It's a member of the G20. It was a traditional leader of the G77 movement and the leader of the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. And it aspires to permanent membership on the UN Security Council, something that the United States government has come out and explicitly supported a couple of years ago. It's a key player on global trade talks. Indeed, it recently stymied an agreement on liberalizing trade at the World Trade Organization and on other issues like sanctions. It has a lot of influence on the subcontinent in countries ranging from Sri Lanka to Nepal to Afghanistan to Bangladesh, and of course has a history of troubled relations with Pakistan. It's a growing military power and is making significant investments in military technology and military platforms. And it's reaping a demographic dividend, the likes of which we don't see in very many places around the world. The average age in India right now is 24, in China it's 34, and in Japan it's 44. And there's a sense in India that now is the time to step on the accelerator of economic growth, which means investments in education, investments in infrastructure, and so forth, in order to reap the demographic dividend of such a young population. Now, all of that said, the last few years have not been very kind to those who favor the dramatic emergence of India as a great power in the world. Economic growth, which was well above 7% for years and years, fell rather significantly to about half that level. Corruption rose, and reforms that had been put in place by the previous government began stalling, and the political system seemed unable to generate a new round of economic reforms that folks largely think is necessary to unleash future economic growth. And the political process itself became calcified. You had a Congress party that was led by the Gandhi family, really behind the scenes, and you had opposition both within the parliament and the rise of state parties that led to a lot of gridlock and an inability to pass important pieces of legislation and really put in place a kind of economic reforms that, again, that many saw as necessary. So against this backdrop, you sort of enter Narendra Modi, who is the new prime minister, and his sweeping electoral success. He was the chief minister of Gujarat state for 13 years, and during his time as chief minister, he presided over economic growth that was north of 13% on an annualized average basis. At the same time, the national average was 7.8%, so it was pretty amazing economic growth. He became known for attracting investment from around India and also from abroad, and turned Gujarat into a major destination of foreign direct investment. And he built the reputation of his state as the most business-friendly one in all of India. But all of that said, he is not in any way a technocrat akin to his predecessor, Manmohan Singh, who had his DPhil from Oxford in economics, who was a former minister of finance, and cut a somewhat apolitical bearing. And he was a soft-spoken man who didn't really jump into the kind of rough and tumble of politics. Modi is a very different kind of guy, and this was evidenced while he was chief minister of Gujarat, where he became renowned for not only his business-friendly policies, but his sweeping speeches in which he sort of tapped into a populist strain. During the election, he couldn't be in more than one place at once, and so and he was such a renowned speaker that the BJP political activists created a hologram that they would project in different towns and villages around India, in which the Indians could come and watch a hologram of Modi deliver a stirring speech. And this seemed to work, and maybe it's something that we should look into here, actually, because it certainly generated votes. But Modi cut his teeth and really dedicated his life to the cause of Hindu nationalism. He grew up and spent his career before politics in the RSS, which is the National Volunteer Organization, the Hindu nationalist organization that organizes both on political and on civil society lines, and pushes forward for a Hindu identity within India. And this has manifested itself already in a few different ways. I believe that Prime Minister Modi is the first prime minister since independence to use a translator when he comes to meetings in Washington. He just visited Washington, and I'll speak about that in a minute. And he can speak and understand English very well, but he conducted all of his meetings speaking Hindi and used a translator rather than in English. Again, very different from recent prime ministers. He's pushed for greater use of Hindi within the Indian bureaucracy, and his ties with American officials until very recently were non-existent. In 2005, he applied for a visa to come to the United States and was rejected. The Bush administration denied his visa application on religious liberty grounds. In 2002, there were riots in the state of Gujarat where somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 Muslims were killed. And Modi's at least alleged complicity in allowing these riots to take place, this violence to happen, led to the State Department denying his visa application. He never tried again, and until earlier this year, when it became clear he was going to win the elections, he had not met with any U.S. officials. And so the U.S. ambassador to India met with Prime Minister Modi about 2 or 3 months before the election, and that was the first real meeting that he had with any government official. The recent Congress party government prided itself on its inclusion and its embrace of the secular aspects of India as enumerated in the Indian Constitution. And so they like to point out that while India is 85% Hindu, they had a Sikh prime minister, a Muslim president, and the head of the Congress party was Sonia Gandhi, the Italian-born Christian who was leading the party. And so they would often tout this inclusiveness and this diversity, whereas while Modi had made an effort to attract Muslim voters based on his economic record in Gujarat, the BJP really embraces the notion of India as a Hindu country, and so now there's a real challenge rooted in the need to govern in an inclusive way. Now, during the election, the BJP and Modi in particular had emphasized not the Hindu aspects as much or the socially conservative aspects of their program, but rather the economic reform ones. They put out an election manifesto, which is about 28 pages or so. Only the last page got into the kind of socially conservative aspects of their program. So they talked about the outrage that is cow slaughter in India and the need to rebuild a temple in Ayodhya on the site of a Muslim mosque. But this was relegated to the back pages of their manifesto. The real meat of what they tried to do and what Modi has tried to do in the few days since he's been elected prime minister is to increase economic growth, to generate manufacturing jobs, to improve sanitation, to crack down on corruption, and he's embraced a couple of mantras to go along with this. So he talks about toilets before temples, saying that sanitation is more important to the people of India than building a bunch of new Hindu temples. And his other mantra now is "Make in India," calling on the world to use India as a manufacturing hub and think of it more akin to China in that sense. Now, there were great expectations of what Modi and the new party would do after they swept into power. And they have been swift to make some changes, but they've been underwhelming in a number of other areas. Some of the more innovative things, there's been a crackdown on absenteeism. There was one study that came out that suggested that possibly up to 50% of Indian bureaucrats don't show up at work on a regular basis. And so the government has established a website that monitors bureaucrats coming and going. So they clock in the morning and they clock out at night, and you can go on this website and see the individual and when he's clocked in and when he's clocked out, which itself sounds interesting, although I checked it out last night and it was unavailable. So take from that, you know, what you will. I'm not sure how that's actually working. The government raised caps on foreign investment in the defense sector and the insurance sector in a bid to attract more foreign direct investment in those areas. Modi invited the president of Pakistan, Nawaz Sharif, to his inauguration, to Modi's inauguration, but then canceled high-level talks with Pakistan after that. And he has spoken warmly of ties with the United States, despite the disaffection that had existed previously, but he's also described Russia as, quote, India's best friend. And so, you know, how all of this shakes out in terms of the geopolitical orientation of the government remains something of a question mark. Now, earlier this month, Modi made a visit to the United States, and commensurate with his reputation as a dynamic speaker and someone who can really fire up the masses, he spoke to more than 20,000 people in Madison Square Garden, which was rented out for him to give a speech. The speech was projected on large TV screens in Times Square. There was a 1-800 number where people could call in and listen to the speech from anywhere in the world or anywhere in the United States live. And that and his meetings on Wall Street and his meetings in Washington generated a great kind of enthusiasm for the U.S.-India relationship and optimism about where he's headed. But the visit itself was somewhat short on sort of concrete policy deliverables and specific initiatives about where to take the relationship going forward. I just sort of note that this visit and the election took place against a backdrop of really kind of a 15-year warming of U.S.-India ties that began under the Clinton administration. Before the 1990s, during the Cold War, the United States and India had very deep mutual distrust. India fancied itself non-aligned, not aligned with either the Soviet bloc or the United States. The United States saw India as more aligned with the Soviet bloc than with the United States. India bought Soviet weapons. It had close economic ties with the Soviet bloc. There was even an Indian cosmonaut, and which was sort of during the Cold War, you know, one of these great symbols of which side you were on. But with the demise of the Soviet Union, economic reforms that began in India in the very early 1990s, and a desire to diversify their international partners, India offered a new potential to the United States, and the United States offered a new potential to India to kind of break out of that mold. And so there were some tentative steps toward closer relations until 1998, when India conducted a nuclear test. And the Clinton administration announced, okay, everything nothing will be the same again. And they put sanctions on India and subsequently sanctions on Pakistan. Those sanctions didn't last very long, largely because of 9/11 and the desire to warm up relations with Pakistan and therefore to do the same with India. And in the Bush administration, then BJP Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee and President Bush met several times and decided to really move relations forward in a dramatic fashion. Over the years, this took a number of shapes, including on the U.S. side to dehyphenate Indo-Pak relations, as it became known. There was always a complaint on the Indian side that the United States saw India only through the prism of its relationship with Pakistan rather than as a great power in its own right. The United States and India concluded a landmark civil nuclear agreement, which became kind of the big issue, the big idea in the bilateral relationship. And then in the Obama administration, the president made a visit in 2010 to India and also announced some very ambitious initiatives, and so changed export control laws to make it easier to transfer technology to India, gave great political momentum to the relationship, announced that the United States supports Indian membership in the UN Security Council. and then the waning days, as I said, of the Congress government saw things kind of stall, and now we're here with Modi at this potential inflection point that allows both Indians and the United States to sort of lift their sights and think about what might be possible in the long run with respect to ties between the two countries. Now, with them, both sides kind of looking forward, I would submit that the order of the day is to think about this relationship in realistic terms rather than romantic terms. And I think over the years, a romanticism has sometimes characterized the U.S.-India relationship. We talk about ties between the world's oldest democracy and the world's largest democracy and sort of think that the rest will sort itself out, when really the United States and India are going to act, obviously, I think, out of interest where they converge and where they don't, and to some degree on the basis of a set of shared values. All of this is happening in the context of a broader, dynamic and rapidly changing Indo-Pacific region. If you look at the Indian Ocean, it's emerging as one locus of naval contest. China is rising in the Western Pacific and beyond, including on the military side by investments in anti-access area denial capabilities and so forth that are designed to deny access to the region to U.S. and other allied forces. And so if we step back from the issues of the day and think about the next 10 years, or the next 20 years, or the next 30 years, there's a sense that one of the overriding ambitions of the United States should be to maintain a stable balance of power in Asia, which is complicated by the fact that we don't know what China's trajectory will look like. And so if that's the case, it's in the American interest to see a region in which the democratic powers are also strong, and that includes India, Japan, Australia, South Korea, and others. And India has the potential to play a somewhat swing role in the balance of power in the Asian region. And so this is really kind of what drives the U.S.-India relationship at its core, which is a recognition that a strong India, despite all of the frustrations attendant with developing closer ties with that country, is in the interest of the United States over the long run. That a strong India that is closer to America is in America's interest over the long run. And given the uncertain trajectories of the various countries, including China, but also the United States in the region, we should be working toward an outcome in which a strong India able to project power in the region has the potential to balance China and work with other countries in the region. Prime Minister Abe in Japan has spoken of a democratic diamond of Japan, India, the United States, and Australia. The Indians have revived the concept of the Quadrilateral security dialogue among those four countries. You're not going to see an alliance of the United States and India. You're not going to see a mutual defense pact. You're not going to see the United States go to war to defend India or India to go to war to defend the United States. But what you'll see, I think, if things work according to the kinds of investments in the diplomatic relationship that both sides have made over a number of years, is a truly unique international relationship, one where it's not an alliance, it's a strategic partnership. It's never a fully comfortable one, but it's one that is animated by shared interests in regional stability, in increased economic ties between the two countries, that is animated by a recognition of India's global role in international institutions on economic matters internationally and so forth, and transnational issues, and that is rooted in a strong degree of shared democratic values, although they manifest themselves in very different ways in the United States and India. So the challenge really, I think, for the United States and for India is to keep the gaze on the long term. The investment in the India relationship has been something that you don't see very frequently in U.S. foreign policy, and that is the absence of transactionalism in the short run. It has not been the case that the United States has approached India and said, okay, we will do this, and we want you to do this right now, and we will do this, and you do this, and you sort of haggle. It has been more an opportunity to invest in the long-term relationship by putting diplomatic capital in the bank, by doing things like recognizing India's aspirations for UN Security Council membership, by changing our export controls regime, by sealing the civil nuclear agreement, things like that, with the idea that the payoff to the United States, well, if it happens, will only happen in the long run by seeing the emergence of this great populist democratic power in a strategically critical part of the world, and that the emergence of that power and the character of its relationship with the United States is very much core to American interests going forward. So that's kind of an overview of the way I see India, both at this very moment, but also over the very long run, and its ties with the United States. And perhaps with that, I'd be happy to entertain any questions you might have.
All right, you know the drill. We have a microphone here on the side. I encourage you to come up. Please tell us your name, what you're studying, and the time is yours to ask questions.
Richard, thank you very much. Fred Axelgard, I'm at the Wheatley Institution. Could you just take a second and talk about some of those ways in which countries who are close allies, major allies, develop that kind of a relationship? I'm thinking of the way that the military and the intelligence communities, say between the United States and Britain, the United States and Australia, they meet, they talk, they get to know each other, they identify common interests, they do things together. But a joint a joint committee between chiefs of staff, that kind of thing. Are those kinds of relationships happening? Are they in the offing with India? And maybe just kind of divert a little bit and talk a little bit about the military-to-military relationship. Mm-hmm. I know we have done some military exercises in the past. Again, it means an awful lot between two countries if the militaries are talking and developing those kinds of relationships, like through exercises. Just wondering about the doability or the near-termedness of kind of a real, maybe strategic, but just a good working relationship that has the tools at hand. Thank you.
In terms of kind of the broad improvement of the relationship, the drawing closer together that you mentioned, for a long time, most of the discussions between U.S. officials and Indian officials were about India or about U.S. policy. And you can gauge the maturity of an international relationship by the degree to which it's about something other than the two countries. So we don't talk to Europe very much about French politics or Italian economics or things like that. We talk to Europe about the Middle East or about Russia or about Africa or about some transnational issues. And that speaks to the maturity of the relationship. And with India, we're moving in that direction, but it's a long process. So for example, there's been a very rich and fruitful dialogue that's taken place over the past couple of years between the United States and India on Greater Asia, how to think about, how does India think about China? How does the United States think about China? How does it think about Southeast Asia? How does it think about Japan? And these are pretty important to take place, because really what you need to do is start with a sense of what the strategic picture looks like on both sides and how both sides are thinking about the world, and then what the opportunities and challenges are going to be on specific issues. And so one of the things that Americans love to do is immediately sort of divide up dialogues. Well, okay, we'll have a dialogue on this, we'll do another one on that. And as of a few years ago, there were 37 separate dialogues between the United States and India, between the U.S. government and India. Well, the Indian Foreign Service is smaller than New Zealand's. It is very, very small. And just to give you an example, the entire Americas department of the Ministry of External Affairs, including the secretary who answers the phone, is 5 people. And they also have no equivalent to the Office of the Secretary of Defense. So the defense policy is really made either in the Prime Minister's office or in the Ministry of External Affairs. So that there's a capacity, a bandwidth issue on the Indian side when it comes to some of these things. So the Obama administration smartly kind of reduced cut in half the number of these dialogues, only 17 or so, but that's still a lot. But to have these dialogues and to sort of share the strategic picture is important, and then to figure out ways in which you can operationalize some of this. The best actually has been on the mill side, and that's been because it's been kind of. It hasn't weathered, it hasn't sort of been affected by a lot of the ups and downs in the relationship or the kind of internal domestic politics and things like that. The military of India and the military of the United States have had a number of exchanges, a number of dialogues. There's the Malabar exercise, which both annually do together. India actually does more military exercises with the United States than with any other country in the world. There's a few military agreements that India has left unsigned for literally years that would make life easier because they would increase interoperability of communications. They would allow both militaries to share logistics in a better way. These have become kind of politically controversial in India, and so they've gone unsigned. So there's work to do, but for many years, actually, the military, the mill exchanges have been sort of at the forefront. The other thing, though, I think is worth mentioning is that you shouldn't think of these only as exchanges between the United States and Indian governments. I mean, the Indian diaspora in the United States is a very important factor in relations between the two countries. The economic relations are, and increasingly educational ties are. India has been mulling significant changes to its higher education policies that would allow foreign universities, for example, to literally set up campuses in India and take other steps like this. And at the beginning of the Cold War, there was a very concerted effort to increase citizens exchanges, educational exchanges, all of the things so that the United States and Western Europe could get to know each other as well as they possibly could. But if you ask yourself, does the average American, know any given Western European country better than it knows India? The answer is probably that it does. And so it's a fairly immature set of non-governmental exchanges between the two sides. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Rachel. I'm a political science major. I just was wondering if you could expound a little bit more on India-China relationships and how a permanent seat on the Security Council would affect the relationship.
Yeah, and well, on the permanent seat, I mean, the official U.S. position, which I think is the right one, is that if the Security Council is enlarged, then India should have a seat. That's different than saying we're going to go and enlarge the Security Council and give India a seat. That nuance is not lost on the Indian side. And so, if you're holding your breath waiting for policy changes at the global level, one of the things I would not hold your breath on is expansion of the UN Security Council. I mean, there's a reason why it has not been expanded since, the mid-1940s. Then there are questions of would they have a veto and all of these things. And so that is unlikely to happen. India-China relations, at the end of the day, what India wants out of its relationship with China is not very dissimilar from what the United States wants out of its relationship with China, which is to say close and growing economic ties, cordial diplomatic ties, and a strategy of hedging your bets in security terms by building up relations with other countries who are present in the region. The United States with India, India with the United States, but also India with Japan, India with Australia, the United States and Vietnam, because of the uncertain trajectory of China's role over the coming years. The Chinese have a habit of sending their military personnel across the contested border with India, usually just a few feet, but it's been up to a couple of miles, and they'll do that on a regular basis, which grates at the Indians, and they'll sometimes calibrate those things to happen when there's some issue going on. So it's a complicated relationship in a way similar to the U.S. relationship with China being complicated, but they don't want to contain China, but they don't want sort of they're not going to be kind of strategic partners with China either. So, yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Matthew. It's actually very similar to what you were just talking about. I had a question about China-Indian borders and everything, and kind of like where would America stand? 'Cause I know like there's been getting a little more tension. Yeah, like you're saying, both sides are getting close to the border, trying to making little adventures, and I mean China claims it and runs it, I guess, but India also makes claims over it. So where would the U.S. stand if there were to be a conflict?
Well, nowhere. I mean, diplomatically, the United States would call for peaceful resolution and refrain from violence and all this stuff. But the United States is not going to get actively involved in a border dispute between the United States and between India and China. I mean, in the back of the Indian mind is 1962 when they fought a border war with the Chinese and lost big time. And that's probably in the back of the Chinese mind to some degree as well. But this is part of the challenge of scoping out what U.S.-India relations look like over the long run, because it's not going to be an alliance. It's not going to be like, we've said to Japan, if China decides to go in the Senkaku Islands, then we would consider that as part of Japan, and that would trigger our commitment to the territorial defense of Japan. We would defend you. That's not going to happen with India, and so the character of our security ties is going to be something much less than some sort of mutual defense agreement. But what exactly that looks like is going to depend a lot on the circumstances of any particular issue. So, in a circumstance like you described, I think a lot would depend where the U.S. came down in terms of at least diplomatically. It would depend to some degree on what the circumstances were, who did what. The instinct would be to side with the Indians, but it would be dependent on the context, I think. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm James Hodgson. I'm studying political science here. And as we talk about the economic growth that India has experienced, and as you mentioned, Modi's focus on those things, the country is also ridden with a lot of social issues in terms of gender inequality, the kissing protests that are going on in Kerala right now, and a lot of other things. What do you think either the United States' role in those social development issues are, or maybe the influence that we could have if we have a moral obligation there, or what do you think the role is in social issues?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, the most incendiary set of issues that has really kind of rocked Indian politics and it got international attention over the last few years has been the role of women in Indian society. On the one hand, women have been at the very height of Indian political power, Indira Gandhi and everything. But the case of some of this violence against women in New Delhi and beyond has really opened folks' eyes and has become a very charged political issue in India. And the Indians, I think they're seized with the issue in a way that they have, I don't think, ever been before. But how that actually translates becomes difficult, because you're not only dealing with a phenomenon of violence against women, for example, that has happened in villages, but increasingly in urban areas. And so, for example, now you have Indian men who previously may have grown up in a village and everything they do would be known to everybody in the village, and there's this kind of social opprobrium that would attach to any kind of activity like this. Now living in suburbs or in urban areas where other than police catching someone doing something, there's not that kind of social force that's been present in the country to keep a lid on some of this for so long. The U.S. role, other than kind of generally supporting the gender rights, the rights of women and so forth, is fairly limited. One of the things when we're talking about kind of human rights in India, one always has to be careful of is not eliciting a backlash to the point that you're trying to get across, by criticizing a proud democracy like India. You can sometimes elicit a defensiveness that undermines what you're trying to do in the first place. And so I think the United States, through USAID and some of the other NGOs and foreign aid programs, have a number of programs and projects that work on these kinds of issues. But in terms of kind of an overarching U.S. approach, I think it's somewhat limited. So, yes, sir.
Chad Nelson, I'm in the political science faculty. You mentioned the U.S.-India nuclear deal.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that came under criticism as violating American traditional stance on proliferation, and it ended up that U.S. companies couldn't benefit from the deal. So I just wanted you to expand a little bit more on what you thought about the U.S.-Indian nuclear deal.
Sure. And well, by way of background, India and Pakistan, neither of them are signatories to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The Non-Proliferation Treaty enshrines a set of nuclear states which possess nuclear weapons, of which India is not one because of the NPT was formalized before India attained a nuclear capacity. And there had been a long-term effort to bring India within the NPT or within the non-proliferation fold. The sort of central bargain of the NPT is if you forswear nuclear weapons, then you can have access to civil nuclear technology, nuclear power plants, and so forth. And if you don't, then you can't. And what India essentially wanted to do was to have an exception. And this was the top of the Indian wish list, was to keep its nuclear weapons, but also to have access to civilian nuclear technology from outside the country. A lot of this is driven within India by its climate change concerns and its energy concerns. It requires such an increase in the production of energy every year to deal with its increasing economy and population. The United States and the Bush administration sealed a deal essentially where it agreed to make that exception in U.S. law and then had to go and persuade other countries to do that at the international level. And the deal was if India would segregate its military reactors where it produces fuel for its nuclear weapons and its civil reactors where it produces fuel for power production, and put those reactors, the civil reactors, under international safeguards, and that if it would be pulled under the four multilateral export control regimes which govern the transfers of these things, then the United States would change its own law, the Atomic Energy Act, to make it an exception specifically for India. And the International Atomic Energy Agency Board of Governors agreed. The Nuclear Suppliers Group, which governs the transfer of nuclear supplies internationally, agreed. So this was all a go. It only required, and then the Indian Parliament passed a law changing its own policies to allow this to happen. Two American companies were supposed to benefit from this by providing nuclear supplies and facilities to India, and then the Indian Parliament came along and passed a unique and extremely sweeping liability law that puts liability for any nuclear accident on the suppliers for up to 85 years, which has had a chilling effect, to say the least. And so there's been no economic benefit for U.S. companies, and this was the big idea for years in the U.S.-India relationship. And so the fact that this has not come to fruition, it hasn't actually concretely come to become operationalized, is a real thorn on the side, particularly among those in the U.S. government who were involved in negotiating this and spending political and diplomatic capital to get this done, both at home and abroad. And so now there is the hope, but it remains only a hope, that Modi at some point will ask the Parliament either to revise the law and pass a new law that would constrain the liability, or try to work out some other kind of deal. It's unclear whether another deal that is not a law can be done. I mean, if Modi sort of signs an agreement or ratifies an international covenant or something like that, there are different views on what would trump what in an Indian court. And so, that it remains complicated and unfulfilled, so that is kind of a central disappointment of the relationship. But on that one, I think hope springs eternal. So we'll see.
I think we're out of time. Let's wrap that up, and thanks to Richard Fontaine for his comments and for your questions today.
Thank you very much for having me. Really appreciate it.